Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever you are. Welcome to another edition of the Esoteric Podcast. What if I were to tell you that everything you thought about history was in fact a lie? What if I were to tell you that there are two very well documented theories of what we should call phantom time? One theory suggests that nearly 300 years of early Middle Age history was invented simply to suit the ego of a man who shaped how the world keeps times forever after. The other theory suggests that about 1,000 years of history was created by the same entities that controlled us simply to hide the fact that we had been utterly destroyed by cosmic forces. Let's start by taking a deep dive into these two theories, starting with the creation of 300 years of history and the central question of did the Middle Ages really exist? The question of does the early Middle Ages really exist was originally posted by Hans Ulrich Niemes, a doctor of history, in 1995, along with a number of colleagues. This question itself, and more so the answer no, the Middle Ages did not exist, is surprising to say the least. It contradicts all basic knowledge and attacks the historian's self-respect to such an extreme that the average person must be patient, benevolent, and open to radical new ideas here. The thesis mainly says, with far-reaching implications and consequences, that between antiquity, which we usually take as 1 AD, and the Renaissance, 1500 AD, historians count approximately 300 years too many in their chronology. In other words, the Roman Emperor Augustus really lived 1700 years ago instead of the conventionally assumed 2000. However, the whole well-known historiography of the Middle Ages contradicts this assertion. The easiest way to understand doubt about the accepted chronology of the well-known history is to seriously systematize the problems of medieval research. This will lead us to detect a pattern which proves this theory and gives reason to assume that a phantom period of approximately 300 years has been inserted somewhere between 600 and 900 AD, either by accident, by misinterpretation of documentation, or by deliberate falsification. This period and all events that are supposed to have happened therein never existed. Buildings and artifacts ascribed to this period belong to other periods. The Carolingian chapel at Aachen will serve as the first example of this. Art historians explain and describe artifacts and buildings of this period as anachronistic, but they never follow up on their assessments. One of the best examples, intensely surveyed, is the Chapel of Aachen, circa 800 AD, which seems to come approximately 200 years too early. The way of constructing an arch shown in this chapel has no predecessor. Arched aisles are usually only in the 11th century in Speyer. The construction of choirs with rising arch and also rising barrel vaulting is not resumed until 200 years later at the portal of Tornus. The vertical steepness of the interior arches of the Aachen chapel is more accentuated than those of churches built 2 centuries earlier. One of these is the 1049 AD consecrated abbey church of Ottmarsham. Although missing some details of the early model, nevertheless it is the best copy of Aachen. However, these and many other arguments implicate that the Chapel of Aachen has been regarded as a building of the second part of the 11th century. Another big research problem is the Anno domini way of counting years. How could 300 phantom years have crept into the accepted chronology, and why didn't anyone notice it? For approximately 2,000 years, people have been counting years correctly, haven't they? Well, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII started the so-called Gregorian calendar, which is basically a corrected version of the old Julian calendar of Julius Caesar. The Julian calendar, after being used for a very long time, no longer corresponded with the astronomical situation. The difference, according to the calculations by Pope Gregory, amounted to 10 days. Now, please calculate how many Julian years does it take to produce an error of 10 days? The answer is 1,257 years. The question, at which date was the Julian calendar correct, can be calculated with the following result. By taking the year in which the Gregorian calendar began, which is 1582, minus the years necessary to produce 10 days of error in the Julian calendar, 1257, equals the beginning of the Julian calendar, which we say here is 325. It seems unbelievable that Caesar introduced his calendar in 325 AD. This is unbelievable because by then he had already been dead for more than 300 years. If 16 centuries had passed since Caesar's introduction of his calendar, the Julian calendar in Gregory's time would have been out of sync with astronomy for a situation by 13 days, not 10. Some historians have noticed this contradiction, but they solve it this way. The scholars in Caesar's time reckoned a different date for the equinox, the day in spring where the day and night have the same length. Yet it can be proved that the Romans used the same day for the equinox as we do, i.e. the 21st of March. If our thesis of 300 phantom years is right, then this thesis must also be valid for the whole of Eurasian African history for a period between 600 AD and 900 AD. In this time period, Byzantium and the new Islamic realms were supposedly fighting each other in the Near East and the Mediterranean. Let us look at Byzantium first. Historians acknowledge a special problem for exactly this period. When did the empire reform its administration? When and how did this reform, called by modern historians reform of the themes, come into being? How did feudalism develop? One group of historians point out that the essentials for this reform were outlined in antiquity, and that therefore the 300 years following 600 AD, nothing happened. Thus, nothing can be said about this period because no historical sources for this supposed reform in this period exist. The group interpolates between the years 600 AD and 900 AD a very slow evolution of the Byzantine society. This evolution was so slow, they say, that the actors themselves hardly noticed it, and thus this evolution didn't produce any written documentation, no archaeological remains either, by the way. The discussion of both groups is termed the debate of continuity. The gap has to be filled by speculation. Therefore, both groups accuse each other of misinterpreting historical sources in an anachronistic manner. Uwe Topper and Manfred Zeller pointed out how to resolve some important riddles and research problems of the Islamic, Persian, Arab, Byzantine world by using the thesis of the phantom years. Ferdowsi's well-known epic, the Shahnameh, written around 1010 AD, ends with the last Persian king, Yazdegerd III, who died in 651 AD. The epic tells nothing about the Islamic conquest of Persia and has no allusions to Islam at all. It simply skips 300 years of Islamic influence as if they never existed. Moreover, the Parisis, the Zarathustra worshippers in India, have been debating their own chronology furiously since messengers from Iran in the 18th century told them that they made a mistake in counting years since their flight from the homeland. This claim evidence, however, has been withdrawn. Even modern encyclopedias vary in their assertion between the 7th and 10th century for the event. A thorough examination of architecture of the Almandi's, they were the famous first Arabic dynasty from 661 AD till 750 AD, detects untypical characteristics for an Islamic dynasty. These unusual characteristics are especially visible in their palaces. We see a painting approximately 725 AD on a wall in spite of the Islamic prohibition against portraying human figures. The painting shows the Persian king Khosrow II paying homage to Almandi sovereign. But by then the Persian king had been dead for approximately 100 years. Introduction of Arabic coins, organized by the Caliph Abd al-Malik in 697 AD, reveals some remarkable contradictions. The Arab coin bears the portrait of the Persian king of Khosrow II, who died a long time before. Manfred Zeller draws the following conclusion from this and other facts. We have to eliminate two phantom times. The first, approximately 78 years from 583 AD until 661 AD, and the second of approximately 218 years from 750 till 968 AD. The first phantom time came into being through artificial separation of the Persian and Almohade history, which in reality was contemporary. Thus, Zeller explains the contradictions of the un-Islamic style in the late appearance of Khosrow II in the Almohade history. The second phantom time is a time-stretching repetition of the Persian history from 528 AD until 661 AD, now in the Islamic style and dated from 750 till 968. Harun al-Rashid is an invention, as is the whole history of his dynasty. Probably Islam did not spread until 10 centuries ago. While this way some riddles of research problems can be solved, others will follow. For instance, the miraculous beginnings of Islam. It is generally known that historians are astonished by this miracle, and a miracle like this needs for an explanation. This is known to all scientists. Gunter Luning has suggested a new scenario. The history of the Jews shows in centuries of darkness and discontinuity that supports the thesis of phantom time. One of the important modern works on Jewish history bears the title The Dark Ages, Jews in Christian Europe of 711 to 1096. Quote, "It seemed that they, the Jews, totally disappeared together with the breakdown of the Roman Empire. However, we do not find any evidence of their presence until the Carolingian period." End quote. For the Carolingian period, historians find only written sources, whereas material sources like building and artifacts exist just for the time after 1000 AD, a Jewish quarter in Regensburg between 1006 and 1020 AD, in Cologne between 1056 and 1075 AD, in Worms around 1080 AD, in Speyer around 1084 AD. And for the other regions outside of Germany, we are told, of course we know from inscriptions and other sources about Jewish societies and single persons in nearly all provinces of the Roman Empire, and we can reasonably suppose, with or without proof, that there was in fact no district without Jews. Nevertheless, there doesn't exist any evidence, only a little probability, that a substantial number of Jews live anywhere in the Western world at this time. How can we find support in archaeological research for our phantom time? In 1986, a conference of archaeologists specializing in medieval towns took place under the heading The Rebirth of Towns in the West from AD 700 to 1050. The participants discussed a puzzling problem. Does continuity in the evolution of the town, postulated by historians, exist or not? Archaeologists could prove that the stratigraphies of towns, adapted to normal chronology, inevitably involved gaps. Where was the continuity? It is generally enigmatic to archaeologists if towns in the early Middle Ages had an economic sense or function. Historians and archaeologists must maintain that no civil town building existed in this period and that only church buildings survived from that time. To justify this, they must assert that at the time towns were not central marketplaces. Few existing examples of stratified German towns give evidence of phantom time. In Frankfurt, archaeological excavations did not find any layer for the period between 650 and 910 AD. Nevertheless, it has been assumed that something had been found in order to avoid empty centuries, which is inconceivable. Thus, the absent period was constructed by layers, composed of waste and ceramic fragments from other locations, which were spread to fill the gap and support known chronology. Archaeological research in ceramics encounters a big problem for the projected phantom time. The evolution of half a century is unclear, writes Peter Vachichlil in his 1991 publication about the ceramics of 8th to 13th centuries from settlements of the main triangle. 30 years earlier, Werner Hartnagel had some troubles with the slow-moving evolution of vessel forms in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries at the North Sea coast. It is impossible to find an order in these ceramic vessels. Even to construct a relative chronology seems to be impossible. Therefore, the ceramic experts try to solve their problems with mathematical and statistical methods. In the same manner as an archaeologist, the researcher of ceramics commits a major mistake, a mistake that Gunter P. Fennering warns of. Independent of existence of written sources for the period, the medieval archaeologist should try to date his finds with archaeological means. It is not permitted to act in a different way than an archaeologist of ancient history. Thus, archaeologists are not permitted to rely on written sources, especially when the archaeological results and the evidence contradict them, even if generations of historians have worked on those written sources. For instance, the framework of the ceramic chronology has been elaborated for 100 years. The researcher correlated each surprising find in accordance with known history. Although more than 100 years ago in the science of antiquity we can find amazing words that may have been a warning. For example, the following quotation from 1888, which deals with the end of the Merovingian period. Quote, "But we do miss a reliable milestone of this kind, like the one provided by the burial hoard of Dornick. The boundary leads to uncertainty, sometimes until the 9th and even 11th centuries." End quote. This shows that each specialist refers to the neighboring discipline to solve his problems of dating, a typical case of circular reasoning. Nobody looks over the whole situation, and therefore nobody is astonished that the same structural problems occur in different disciplines. The most common objection to this idea says that methods of scientific dating are infallible and beyond the danger of circular reasoning. Of these methods, the best known are RC14 and dendrochronology. As RC14 is now calibrated by and therefore dependent on dendrochronology, it is insignificant for the medieval period. Horst Wilcom said, "We use the C14 method only to correlate a sample of carbon with a certain tree ring. This method, at least for the post-glacial period, has become a relative method." Dendrochronology works because each time period creates typical sequences of tree rings. With the help of overlapping sequences of different trees, it is possible to construct a standard sequence that reaches back centuries for a given region. In this standard sequence, you can find for any suitable wood the corresponding age of growth of this tree. This seems to be a very simple theory. You have to count the tree rings if you want to find the exact year. That's it. But as each individual wood differs from the other and also differs from the standard sequence, dendrochronologists must work with a tremendous mathematical apparatus. Transformation of the ring width in logarithmic differences, preferential treatment of the correlating algorithmic theoretical derivation of congruent patterns, distant regressions of similarity, regional analysis, test function, and the scope of dating, statistics of sapwood and loss of tree rings, distribution of centered differences between dating of art styles, and dendrochronology dating. Using this method, one easily commits errors. The following demonstrates this. Researchers erroneously constructed an interval between 12,000 BC and 500 AD by synchronizing North and Central European oak wood. In one of the synchronizations, the error amounted to 71 years. Not only these 71 years are alarming, but also the error itself. Methodologically, the error was duly kept at 71 years because otherwise the wood, dated before with other methods, would not fit historically. But how was it possible to locate these 71 years in the standard sequence? Are the mathematical methods so flexible? Distrust is necessary, even more so because the author of that publication emphasizes that in this case of dating, some unfavorable circumstances accumulated, such as might happen in every laboratory. There is another argument against applying dendrochronology to the Middle Ages. The number of suitable samples of wood which connect antiquity and the Middle Ages is very small, but only a great number of samples would give certainty against error. For the period of about 380 AD, we have only 3. For the period of about 720 AD, only 4 suitable samples of wood. Usually 50 samples serve for dating purposes. Another argument against dendrochronology consists of its own history. In 1970, Ernst Holstein, one of the most famous, most active dendrochronologists in Germany, proclaimed after 8 years of research a great success. He had solved the problem of bridging the early Middle Ages. Now, he could date all samples back to the Roman time, absolutely and exactly, but he paid a high price. Too high, as we know today. He did in fact change his method. Instead of using oak for his oak chronology, he used copper beechwood to fill the gap. But 10 years later, in 1980, it was no longer necessary to use beechwood for the oak chronology. He fortunately had found fitting oak wood. But dates he had defined in 1970 were irrevocable. This is unusual in science, and he did it only reluctantly, as we can see from the following quotation, where he described his method, quote, "The method is unbiased and basically not graphic, because it combines many calculation operations, and you have to do more operations. The more the problem of dating is distant from today and from comparable history secured dates. At borderline, where totally leaving known history, e.g. analyzing 2 completely unknown samples of trees which grew supposedly at the same time, the a priori probability of finding the right date can become so small that only a little chance remains of finding it. For trees of the post-glacial, the probability is approximately 1 in 1,000. These hints show clearly the biggest difficulty of dendrochronological method." End quote. All attempts to get enough tree ring sequences from timber from the Carolingian times have failed. It is strange, but it proved as extremely difficult to connect the Merovingian wood samples from excavations with the above-mentioned chronologies. A good scientist in trouble usually sends out signals for help, sometimes unconsciously, and so does Holstein. After listing his tree ring dates secured by what he terms the oldest historical documented year-by-year dates, he says it is good to know that the West German oak chronology for nearly 1,000 years is exactly under control year by year. Going back to earlier millennia, the missing documentary frame has to be substituted by an essentially tightened correlation. We could express this statement thus: it is very difficult to point out the years before 1000 AD because we do not have any dates supported by written documents. Why not quote more recent test results? A Hamburg dendrochronologist that responded to the original author's request for information in December 1994 stated that today sequences and dates are no longer published because there exists a danger of abuse. Hobby dendrochronologists earned money by dating, for example, timbers of houses for private clients with unreliable methods, so laboratories in Europe and worldwide exchange their dates without publishing them. After a cursory glance over the riddles and research problems, 2 great questions remain. How was it possible to insert this phantom time into history? Or, asked in a provocative manner, who and when and how and why falsified history by adding 300 years? And the second question, How can it be possible to discuss the thesis of the phantom time in the scientific community without being discriminated against as some von Daniken of the Middle Ages? Both questions are more closely connected than you might assume at first thought. One could try and find the answer to the first question in postulating a theory of conspiracy, the Freemasons, Catholic Church, or one of the Catholic monk orders, such as the Benedictine, or the Jesuits, or any other secret society. But this, I suppose, will deter scientists. And this answer is only far too simple. It is also essentially wrong. The second question, the question of the scientific community, could be put this way. Why did the stupid science and researcher did not notice this gap before? Why did some outsider have to come and ask the question and start finding the solution? The second question implicitly triggers the threat of changing of paradigms, which implies a threat to confidence in the work of all science and all scientific work in historical research. Thomas S. Kuhn discusses this situation regarding science in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But in our case, something new appears. For the historical period, and especially the Middle Ages, no paradigms have ever been challenged. This may sound pathetic or megalomaniacal, and accusations of this kind will come from specialists who have to reckon with enormous shifting and new structures in their field. But nevertheless, this question can only find answer through discussion within academic circles if it is to be answered at all. Let us go through some of the questions in detail. First question, why do we suppose that 3 centuries have been faked in medieval history? Our discovery began when we accidentally learned about the problem of faked documents in the Middle Ages. Here we can look at the September 1986 conference of the Momenta Germaniae Historiae, which looked at the falsification of documents in the Middle Ages. It is thus easier to study this kind of research. You can find medieval falsification in every kind of document. The medievalist is confronted with a dangerous and confusing host of false documents, and this was the reason for organizing this conference. The Bavarian State Secretary of Education and Culture, Hans Mayer, summarized the problem, and nobody came to contradict him. Falsifications in the Middle Ages are no minor subject for the medievalist. The question for authenticity of the documents, and even more, the concept of truth, is an important period of history in mankind. The important question of the medievalist is, how was history made? Because he knows how false history can be made. We were really impressed by one of the lecturers, a lecture about the great numbers of fake and suspicious documents. It was at the end of the conference when Horst Fuhrmann, president of the Momenta Germaniae Historica, emphasized a special peculiarity of some of the important faked documents. He demonstrated that the important fakes of the Roman Catholic Church have anticipating character. These documents had to wait their great moment to come. Centuries after being produced, these fakes were integrated into the framework of the clerical and lay world. Fuhrmann's opinion was that in the first place, the environment must exist before a fake can be effective. It is naive positivism to argue that fakes like the ones represented here could have changed the world. An assertion like this confuses cause and effect. Rather, a correspondingly changed world had accepted the fakes. Or, in other words, the evolving papal centralism didn't need the fakes, but the fakes needed the evolution of papal centralism in order to become successful. But why did the Church falsify documents when they were unnecessary? Yet this was not what aroused our astonishment, although this statement, even born from need to solve a riddle, was a ridiculous explanation. We were shown fakes from preceding centuries. We divined chronological distortions. Therefore, we inspected the calendar calculation mentioned above with the result of a time error amounting to 3 centuries. And we looked for gaps in special reports and publications, also for periods of stagnation or strange events repeated in a similar manner after approximately 300 years. I only referred to some of a great number of puzzles. A gap in the history of the building of Constantinople in 558 to 908 AD. A gap in the doctrine of faith, especially the gap in the evolution of theory and meaning of purgatory, which leads us from 600 AD until about 1100 AD. A 300-year-long reluctant introduction of farming techniques, the 3-acre system, horse with comet, and of war techniques, stirrup. A gap in the mosaic art from 565 to 1018 AD. These puzzles led the way, pointing out again and again the gap which soon became termed phantom time. But who could have an interest in faking so many documents, and why did the fakers need a phantom time of 300 years? We developed two hypotheses which basically don't contradict. Hypothesis 1. Otto III didn't live accidentally around the year 1000 AD. He himself had defined this date. He wanted to reign in this year because this suited his understanding of Christian millennialism. He defined this date with the help of his famous and well-versed friend who would later become Pope Sylvester II. In reality, they lived approximately 700 years after the birth of Christ, if we're taking that as a date, but never until then had the years been reckoned after Christ. Perhaps unaware of their error and without intending to falsify, they defined one special year as 1000 AD. Consequently, chronologers had to invent 300 years of history to fill up empty periods. What a great occasion for dynasties and kings. You can design the planned future as a construct of the past, and this apparently happened. Otto III constructed Charlemagne as the model hero he himself wanted to be. Supposedly he sketched Charlemagne's history only a bit, or it wasn't even him but the generations after him who lined out a full life picture. Especially the clergy hoped to take advantage of the confrontation with the emperor which had started in the 11th century. Hypothesis 2. Constantine VII of Byzantium, 905 to 959 AD, organized a complete rewriting of the whole Byzantine history. The famous German Byzantinist Peter Schreider had demonstrated how official historiographies interpret this process. Beginning in the year 835 AD, monks rewrote piece by piece all texts which had been written in Greek manuscripts in the new form of writing, hence called minuscula. The postulation is that each text was produced only once. Then the originals were destroyed. This means that all existing texts of the then leading culture nation had been changed or rewritten completely in a new script in the lifetime of 2 generations, or even faster, and have been well invented. It is not important to explain the motivation of the Emperor Constantine VII, only to demonstrate that an action of rewriting and faking like this had happened. If it could happen in Byzantium, it might happen in any other place too. Moreover, the mother of Otto III came from Byzantium and was the niece of the emperor, a descendant of the same dynasty as Constantine VII. As to the question of who faked and why, there are many speculations. It seems that in this question surprises are ahead which could create trouble for many academic institutions as well as other social groups. Second question, how is it possible to do research of this kind inside the scientific community? It is perhaps necessary to do research outside the scientific community because it would demand a big change of paradigms, which means the end of certainty with regard to chronology. Usually, a program of research relies on given research problems which the general public defines. What will happen when new research program in regard with its thesis or approach is too far from the general public interest or too far from the academic society. Who shall give financial support? Always a big question. Then we don't have the capability of joining normal science. I am aware of standing on the shoulders of our predecessors and that we work using their results. I can only emphasize again and again my respect for archaeologists and the scientists who are able to uncover artifacts and construct theories on them. I would like to repeat that our method consists in questioning specific research problems of archaeology and history. I must emphasize that the thesis of the Phantom Years is one proposal for solving these problems. It works surprisingly well and yields amazing results. It seems that scientists today do not see the common pattern in all the problems which repeatedly appear, because there exists an unexpressed and unconscious prohibition against questioning the chronology as if it were impeachable. My request, therefore, is where and how could our research possibly join? What could we do together? Until today, our research work was done marginally, but from now on it enters an important stage. The project has become so big that it cannot be worked on by a few people with small resources. Support from official institution has become necessary, so that for this to continue at the edge of speciality, such as suggested by Kron and Kuppers, papers in the book The Self-Organization of Science Society. It is only through activities in the margin of scientific institutions that outsiders can amplify the disturbances so that instabilities will appear, which in the end will restructure existing research. If some colleagues accuse this of unrealistic or even fantastic behavior, it should be expressed that it could not be a mortal sin in the business of science to question paradigms and slaughter holy cows. So what can be requested from the historian, the archaeologist of the Middle Ages, the philologist, the philosopher? What would be done in their place? Important is the need for discussion. There exists two attitudes towards research. One of them is direct professional approach, history, archaeology, and philology. The other is discussing the theory of knowledge and science. Obviously, this project is one of interdisciplinary research. Only in this way can there be any way to produce the expected change of paradigm with the necessary emotional distance. Now we move on from the world of the purely academic into slightly more speculative realms. There is a series of catastrophes of cosmological origins, mainly changes of planetary orbits and the effects that happened just a few centuries ago. Massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, ocean water levels rose, debris from comets fell, and they themselves scorched the earth, creating the Sahara. And the earth was a victim of tremendous electrical discharges. The Grand Canyon was created by one of these discharges, most likely of a celestial origin. Before the disaster, the Sahara was green and full of cities. After that disaster, worldwide civilizations descended into chaos, and the reset took at least 4 or 5 generations, during which the newly created Catholic Church emerged as the leader of new power structures, and they artificially injected into official historical chronology around 1,000 years. That is why there is supposed 1,000 years of Dark Ages, claim that Europe was stuck in the same place, to cover up the catastrophes. It is interesting to note that the word bishop itself means one who knows the stars, skies, and heaven. The Renaissance was in reality just a rebuilding of pre-disaster, disaster meaning fallen star, comet, however you wish to think of it, Roman civilization, which ended around the 5th century AD, when disaster happened worldwide, destroying existing power structures of the world, reducing people to savagery and leading to most of them becoming illiterate after a few generations. Then, when the situation stabilized, the rebuilding started. Study old maps and books, it's all there. We went from around the 5th century AD straight into the 15th century AD with 1,000 years that never existed. Pompeii was still existing just 5 centuries ago. As well, Pliny the Elder that was killed when he went to see himself the Vesuvius eruption that destroyed Pompeii. Even the culture and clothes during the end of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance were very similar, and right before the Renaissance, pagan Roman gods and their icons still dominated. There is a lot of evidence of change on a planetary scale in and around the 14th, 15th century, and later, but to a much lesser degree, including descriptions of what happened, where and when, such as etchings, images in books, or history of indigenous peoples, mythology, symbology. A lot of symbols are astronomy and astronomically based with planets and related elements, such as. And even official Western documents they overlook when they were rewriting and censoring history. They even made a lot of contradictions. All you got to do is study the etchings of old maps and books. Worldwide, there are stone buildings to this day partially buried, often covering the whole first story. Laymen call that mudfoot, but reality is much more complicated. Pompeii was on maps until 1631 AD, according to the Gregorian calendar, and right after that, maps showed Pompeii in ruins and Vesuvius after eruption, and then no more Pompeii on newer maps. Medical instruments found in the ruins of Pompeii were very similar to those used in the 16th century, so surgical progress was stuck for 1500 years, right? Well, maybe not. There are many maps from just 4 or 5 centuries ago showing an area where the Sahara is now green with cities, lakes, animals, and rivers. It was full of cities, and newer maps show less and less of them. Some are still shown as destroyed. Until it's just Sahara as we know it today, empty, no more lakes or cities. The ancient text's official narrative bases the chronology on what they claim are copies, which in reality are forged and allowed by the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, starting with Joseph Scaliger rewriting history as they wanted to suit their own agendas. The ancient statues of Rome, Greece, and Egypt were discovered after 14th, 15th century AD, when the rebuilding happened just a few generations after a series of worldwide disasters, which are described as being triggered by celestial phenomena, especially comets, that were linked to sudden plague outbreaks. After global disasters, to stabilize social political situations and to regain control over society, ruling classes were to burning books and killing people branded heretics or witches in order to censor and rewrite history, creating new versions with chronology deliberately stretched out, in which they made up 1,000 phantom years, which they had to fill with something, so they made up and copied events and personas to fill these made up 1,000 years. That is why they say history repeats itself, and claim European Dark Ages last 1,000 years, and many other historical anomalies lasting around 1,000 or 1,000 plus years, such as the Polynesian long pools in exploration that official versions of history claim lasted 1,000 years. Jesuits, starting with Joseph Scaliger, were responsible for most of censorship and rewriting of history. The amount of events that supposedly happened during these 1,000 phantom years between the 5th and 15th centuries on the Gregorian calendar is suspiciously extremely low for a 1,000-year period, and they are mostly either the same or very similar events that happened before the period. The 1,000 years between the 5th and 15th century on the Gregorian calendar simply never happened and were invented partially as a cover-up for disaster. Here are a few examples. 1. Charlemagne was not a real person, but one of the phantom individuals the Catholic Church made up in order to fill their phantom years, and Charlemagne is based on a real-life man known as Odoacer. 2. Plato and Gemistus Pletheion are one and the same. 3. Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun are the same person. 4. The Black Plague, Great Plague, Black Death, Bubonic Plague is just a copy-paste instance of the Justinian Plague, which really did happen, and was triggered possibly by electrical comets discharging in the atmosphere, which was used to be called wandering stars. When catastrophes happened, civilizations collapsed, and the ensuing chaos rapidly regressed to primitive states, in which over generations most knowledge had been lost among average people, like in the Bronze Age collapse, and people became illiterate. At the same time, soon after the Roman Empire collapsed, both Western and Eastern, new power structures formed, and eventually a leader, in the form of the Catholic Church, emerged and immediately starts their campaign of censorship through mass book burnings and killing off of people who still possessed and spread detrimental information to the Catholic Church, knowledge of real history, especially catastrophes that happened recently, by branding them as heretics and witches, while at the same time using brainwashing techniques like today's media does to spread Catholic propaganda. It has been suggested that the invention of the confessional was an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as an important part of religious dogma. It is also said that the Catholic Church is more heavily interwoven with the Jesuits, which are a military order in their hierarchy, as the head of the Jesuits is literally titled the Superior General. When the Church sent their men after catastrophes to check on the situation in North America, what did they decide to do? Burn natives' books and destroy their culture and impose upon them Catholicism by force. Even the word Catholic comes from a Greek word which means universal, and indeed the Catholic Church is a mixture of different religious cults, as they were forced to unite people with polytheistic beliefs, which were the majority in the pre-disaster Roman Empire. Even when you look at statues and icons, etc., right before the Renaissance, you will see the people still worshipped the Roman pagan gods, not Jesus or Mary, because 1,000 years between the 5th and 15th century AD, according to the Gregorian calendar, never existed. These major disasters are inevitable and will happen no matter what. That is why there is such a push to create outposts on other planets, especially Mars, and when they happen, collapse of civilization will be imminent. When that happens, people will turn into savages. Most will die, some will survive, and will fight between each other in small little gangs or tribes with no plans for anything, because they will be too busy with their basic survival, and humanity would probably be stuck in that phase for a very long time, and would take a huge amount of time to recover to get to the level we are now. That's a very simplified summary of what would most likely happen, and it may be one of the reasons for a push towards centralized power, a united world government, to prevent what was described above. Since we can't take everybody safe places during disasters, and we want the most intelligent and capable people to survive, to be able to rebuild and restart a civilization, the intellectual elite will prepare themselves for that by going into bunkers without telling the rest of us peasants what is happening, why and when, and so that it will happen and it will be over, and the elites will emerge from the bunkers with all of their technology and knowledge to re-establish civilization and impose order on us savages. But when that happens, it will be, in a way, to enslave us. Worldwide, civilization decimating events happen over and over again, and are mostly of a cosmological origin. There is a reason why ancient civilizations, no matter how primitive, usually had astronomical observatories and knowledge. Even little tribes invested heavily into studying the skies, especially the heavens, because ancient skies were as active and a source of many disasters. Hence, astrology, predictions of future based on the positions of celestial objects, was very important and was considered a legitimate scientific field, because celestial objects affect the Earth in many ways, often being responsible for volcano eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes, tornadoes, sudden extreme climate changes leading to the collapse of civilization, mass famine, and other factors. This is often covered up, and not many books talk about it because of how extremely devastating it is, and the ruling elite can do nothing when the next event is likely to happen, and there will be many signs before it happens. For example, birds falling en masse off of the sky, and fish beaching themselves en masse due to changes in the Earth's electromagnetic field. Birds and fish use electromagnetic forces as a form of natural GPS, and celestial objects with large enough mass can affect it. There is nothing more dangerous to human civilization than celestial objects and the cosmos itself. Just a few centuries ago, we had a worldwide collapse of civilization, and the most centralized powers of the time did such a great job at rebuilding and uniting different groups that many people today have absolutely no idea that it even happened. There is a theory that reoccurring worldwide civilization collapsing results are the result of our solar system having once been a binary star system, having lost one of its stars. And this is what is responsible for the almost 26,000 year long Great Year, or procession of equinoxes and great disasters that happened when our current sun got closer to the other sun due to gravitational and electromagnetic anomalies. This kind of disaster happens over and over again, and our intellectual elite has been preparing themselves for the next global disaster by diverting money, mostly from the Pentagon. Over $21 trillion is currently missing, and that money has most likely been used in another world economy, probably to build the entire cities inside the Earth's surface. Backups for the elites if our surface world were to be totally decimated after the next disaster. There are entire underground ancient cities all over the world with the capability of housing thousands of people. There is one in Turkey which could house 20,000. Because each time catastrophes like ones described happen, intellectual elites go there during that time and later re-emerge on the surface as gods with all their knowledge, and then they re-establish themselves and go on over the world to kickstart civilizations. When the next catastrophe happens due to changes of electromagnetic field, most people who won't be hiding in shielded bunkers with the elite will probably turn into psychopathic cannibals. It wouldn't be the first time. And our elites know that. That's probably why zombies are such a popular part of culture, and the Pentagon has even created plans for a zombie apocalypse. Unusual cosmological activity caused extreme disasters on a global scale, destroying and resettling civilization, and that is why things like that has been presented here are possible. The world was a much more connected place before these catastrophes, much more like it is today. For a look at some of the books that may be of interest for those who are looking to acquaint themselves with this knowledge of the truth about history, we can look at The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended by Sir Isaac Newton. And there is also the Aurolinda book, a text from Frisian people who migrated from their island, which they believed existed just a few hundred years ago, and was still on maps right next to Iceland before it was submerged when the ocean levels rose due to climate change brought on by catastrophes, to somewhere in today's northwestern Germany. This text, when it emerged in the public, was hated and fiercely fought against by the elites because it survived the censorship attempts over the centuries where they burned non-approved books, especially those of a historical element. The Kolbrin, a group of texts telling a very different account of history compared to the modern official narrative, and it supports the claim of worldwide catastrophes. These are also available online. And another book which is perhaps a little less serious to take, but is also of good interest, is a book that was originally censored, sanitized, and eventually declassified by the CIA, known as The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas. And on that note, we come to the end of this week's episode. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and it leaves me just to say thank you very much for listening, wherever, whenever, whatever you are, and I hope you'll join us for another episode very soon. Thank you, and goodbye.